The DOJ has seized over $700 million of Maduro-linked assets.
What if the man who swore he would never abandon Venezuela was secretly preparing to run? New footage suggests Nicolas Maduro may have fled before a U.S. attack. Exclusive reports from Washington reveal the real reason Maduro fled, and it's all because of Trump's unbelievable move. The $50 million bounty that shocked the world. This story exposes a disturbing pattern, a trail of betrayal, hypocrisy, and corruption that stretches back years. It's a story about how Venezuela's leader publicly condemned anyone who dared leave the country while quietly plotting his own escape route. It's about how the very same man who mocked defectors as traitors allegedly brokered secret deals to guarantee his own safety abroad. Now let's rewind for a moment, because to truly understand why this leaked footage is so explosive, you need the context. The morning of August 7th, 2025, Attorney General Pam Bondi stepped in front of cameras with an announcement that would send shockwaves through the halls of power in Caracas, Venezuela. In a meticulously crafted video message posted across social media platforms, she declared something unprecedented in modern diplomatic history. The United States was doubling its bounty on Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro to an astronomical $50 million. But this wasn't just another diplomatic slap on the wrist. This was warfare by another name.
Today, the Department of Justice and State Department are announcing a historic $50 million reward for information leading to the arrest of Nicolas Maduro. The DOJ has seized over $700 million of Maduro-linked assets, including 2 private jets, 9 vehicles, and more.
To understand the gravity of this moment, you need to grasp what $50 million represents in the shadowy world of international bounty hunting. This bounty now stands as the highest ever offered in the history of the Narcotics Rewards Program, a sum so staggering that it dwarfs the rewards placed on some of history's most notorious terrorists and drug lords. For context, the United States offered $25 million for Osama bin Laden. Maduro's bounty is now double that amount. The implications are crystal clear. In the eyes of the Trump administration, Nicolas Maduro isn't just an adversarial head of state. He's been reclassified as something far more dangerous, a global criminal mastermind whose capture has become a matter of urgent national security. The journey to this $50 million moment didn't happen overnight. It's a story that began during Trump's first presidency, escalated under Biden, and has now reached a fever pitch that threatens to reshape the entire geopolitical landscape of the Western Hemisphere. The bounty's evolution tells a tale of steadily escalating tensions. It started at $15 million in March 2020, following Maduro's indictment for narco-terrorism. The Biden administration then raised it to $25 million in January 2025, timing the announcement to coincide with Maduro's controversial third inauguration. But Trump's team didn't just incrementally increase the pressure, they obliterated all previous precedents. Attorney General Bondi didn't mince words in her devastating assessment of the Venezuelan leader. She painted a picture of a man who had transformed an entire nation into his personal drug trafficking empire. Bondi accused Maduro of being one of the largest narco-traffickers in the world and a threat to our national security, emphasizing his alleged collaboration with criminal organizations, including Venezuela's Tren de Aragua gang and Mexico's Sinaloa cartel. The numbers she presented were staggering and painted a picture of industrial-scale criminality. The Drug Enforcement Administration had seized 30 tons of cocaine linked to Maduro's associates, with nearly 7 tons directly tied to the Venezuelan president himself. But the financial seizures were perhaps even more telling. Over $700 million in assets, including 2 private jets and 9 vehicles, had been confiscated in connection to Maduro since September 2024. These weren't just statistics. They represented what U.S. officials characterized as the systematic transformation of Venezuela's government into what they termed a narco-state. The Treasury Department had designated Maduro's organization, the Cartel de los Soles, as a specially designated global terrorist organization on July 25, 2025, elevating the Venezuelan government to the same threat level as ISIS and Al-Qaeda in the eyes of American counterterrorism law. The bounty announcement wasn't made in isolation. It came accompanied by a comprehensive strategy to dismantle what U.S. officials described as Maduro's criminal network. Additional rewards of $25 million and $15 million were offered for Interior Minister Diosdado Cabello and Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez, respectively, essentially placing bounties on the heads of Venezuela's entire security apparatus. The practical mechanics of collecting this bounty were laid out with bureaucratic precision that belied the explosive nature of the announcement. The State Department established multiple channels for tipsters. Confidential tips could be submitted via the DEA at +1 202 681 8187 through voice, WhatsApp, Signal, Telegram, or text, or by email at cartelsolstips@usdoj.gov. Tips could also be submitted through U.S. embassies or consulates worldwide, creating a global intelligence network focused on a single target. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the announcement was what it represented in terms of precedent. Never before had the United States placed such an enormous bounty on a sitting head of state who wasn't actively engaged in warfare with America. This wasn't about terrorism in the traditional sense. This was about drugs, money, and the fundamental question of who controls the flow of narcotics into the United States. Secretary of State Marco Rubio reinforced the administration's position with language that left no room for diplomatic ambiguity. He emphasized that Maduro had led the Cartel de los Soles for over a decade and represented a clear threat to American national security. The implication was unmistakable. This wasn't about regime change for ideological reasons. This was about law enforcement on a global scale. The timing of the announcement was also strategically significant. It came as the U.S. continued to refuse recognition of Maduro's victories in both the 2018 and 2024 Venezuelan presidential elections, citing widespread fraud. Instead, the U.S. recognized opposition leader Edmundo González Urrutia as Venezuela's legitimate president-elect, creating a bizarre situation where America was simultaneously offering a bounty on one Venezuelan leader while recognizing another as the country's rightful president. The $50 million bounty represented more than just an escalation. It was a declaration that traditional diplomatic channels had been exhausted. When a government places a bounty equivalent to a small nation's GDP on a foreign leader, it's sending a message that extends far beyond that individual. It's announcing to the world that certain behaviors will not be tolerated, regardless of sovereignty, regardless of international law, and regardless of the potential consequences. As news of the bounty spread across social media platforms and international news networks, one thing became abundantly clear. The relationship between the United States and Venezuela had crossed a line from which there might be no return. The question was no longer whether tensions would escalate, but how far they would go and what the ultimate cost would be for both nations and the world. Warships, militias, and the dance of destruction. If the $50 million bounty was the diplomatic equivalent of a declaration of war, what happened next transformed that declaration into visible, tangible military reality. Within days of Attorney General Bondi's announcement, the Caribbean Sea began to witness a buildup of American naval power not seen in the region since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Pentagon's response was swift, decisive, and unmistakably threatening. 3 Aegis-class guided missile destroyers, the USS Gravely, USS Jason Dunham, and USS Sampson, were deployed to the southern Caribbean near Venezuelan waters, accompanied by approximately 4,000 service members, including 2,200 Marines. But this was just the tip of the iceberg. Additional vessels, including the USS Erie guided missile cruiser and the USS Newport News nuclear-powered submarine, were reportedly dispatched to the region. To understand the magnitude of this deployment, consider what these ships represent. Aegis-class destroyers are among the most sophisticated warships ever built, each one a floating fortress equipped with advanced radar systems, missile defense capabilities, and enough firepower to level entire city blocks. The inclusion of a nuclear-powered submarine adds an entirely different dimension of threat. These vessels can operate submerged for months, striking targets hundreds of miles inland with Tomahawk cruise missiles while remaining completely undetected. The official justification was carefully crafted to maintain plausible deniability while sending an unmistakable message. The deployments were framed as part of President Trump's intensified anti-drug cartel operations, targeting what the U.S. claimed was Maduro's leadership of the Cartel de los Soles. This was psychological warfare disguised as law enforcement, using the legal framework of drug interdiction to justify what was essentially a naval blockade. The ships were expected to operate in international waters and airspace for intelligence gathering and interdiction purposes, maintaining just enough legal distance to avoid outright acts of war while maximizing the psychological pressure on Maduro's government. But everyone involved understood the real message. The United States had positioned enough firepower off Venezuela's coast to cripple the country's infrastructure within hours if the order was given. The scale of the operation represented more than just muscle flexing. Maritime patrol aircraft, amphibious assault ships, and the comprehensive nature of the deployment marked one of the most significant U.S. naval efforts in the Caribbean in recent years. This wasn't a show of force. This was preparation for potential military action on a scale that could reshape the entire region. But if the United States expected Maduro to cower in the face of this overwhelming display of military might, they fundamentally misunderstood the man they were dealing with. Rather than seeking diplomatic off-ramps or attempting to de-escalate the situation, Maduro's response was to double down in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. The Venezuelan president's counter-move was as audacious as it was unprecedented. On August 18, 2025, Maduro announced the mobilization of over 4.5 million militia members across Venezuela to defend national territory. To put this number in perspective, this represented mobilizing more people than the total active duty personnel of most of the world's largest militaries combined. But this wasn't just a paper mobilization. Across Venezuela, recruitment drives kicked into overdrive with scenes that seemed torn from a revolutionary handbook. In Caracas, civilians including housewives, retirees, students, and factory workers lined up to enlist in the Bolivarian militia. The images were striking. Elderly women learning to handle assault rifles, teenagers training in urban warfare tactics, entire families signing up together to defend their homeland against what they were told was an imminent American invasion. The militia mobilization was accompanied by a comprehensive military response that demonstrated Maduro's determination to meet force with force. Warships and drones were deployed along Venezuela's coastline, and all civilian drones were grounded for 30 days to counter perceived U.S. threats. This wasn't just defensive posturing, it was the militarization of an entire society. But Maduro's most provocative move was yet to come. He ordered 15,000 troops to be stationed along Venezuela's border with Colombia, ostensibly for counter-narcotics operations, but with the clear implication that these forces could be redeployed to face any U.S. incursion. The irony was palpable. Both sides were now using the war on drugs as justification for military buildups that had nothing to do with narcotics and everything to do with geopolitical dominance. The human dimension of this escalation was perhaps most visible in the recruitment drives taking place across Venezuelan cities. Videos emerged of militia training sessions where ordinary citizens practiced urban warfare techniques, learned to construct improvised explosive devices, and received ideological indoctrination about the coming American invasion. The transformation was remarkable. A nation already devastated by economic collapse was now willingly militarizing itself in preparation for a war that might never come, but felt increasingly inevitable with each passing day. From the White House, the messaging remained consistent but ominous. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt delivered what many interpreted as the administration's most direct threat yet.
What I will say with respect to Venezuela, President Trump has been very clear and consistent. He's prepared to use every element of American power to stop drugs from flooding into our country and to bring those responsible to justice.
Bondi continued, referring to the Maduro regime as illegitimate.
The Maduro regime is not the legitimate government of Venezuela. It is a narco-terror cartel. In Maduro, it is the view of this administration, is not a legitimate president. He is a fugitive head of this cartel who has been indicted in the United States for trafficking drugs into the country.
The language was carefully chosen but unmistakably threatening. Every element of American power was diplomatic code for military action. The characterization of Venezuela's government as a narco-terror cartel, rather than a sovereign state, provided legal justification for actions that would otherwise constitute acts of war. International reactions began to polarize along predictable lines, but with some surprising developments that highlighted the global implications of this standoff. Trinidad and Tobago, despite its proximity to Venezuela, publicly endorsed the U.S. naval deployment and offered to facilitate operations from its territory. This was particularly significant given Trinidad's location just 7 miles from the Venezuelan coast. It effectively meant that U.S. forces had a staging ground within sight of Venezuelan territory. Meanwhile, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov reaffirmed Moscow's support for Maduro's government, creating the specter of a proxy confrontation between two nuclear powers in America's backyard. The ghost of the Cold War seemed to be materializing in the warm waters of the Caribbean, with Venezuela serving as the potential flashpoint for a conflict that could draw in multiple world powers. The most chilling aspect of this military buildup was how quickly it had escalated beyond anyone's ability to control. What had started as a diplomatic dispute over election legitimacy and drug trafficking allegations had transformed into a military standoff involving tens of thousands of personnel, billions of dollars worth of military equipment, and millions of civilians being trained for guerrilla warfare. Each side's response response to the other's escalation had created a momentum of its own, pushing both nations toward a confrontation that neither could easily back down from without losing face. As American warships patrolled international waters just miles from Venezuelan territory, and millions of Venezuelan militiamen trained for urban warfare in city squares and village centers, the world watched nervously. The question was no longer whether this situation could be resolved diplomatically. It was whether it could be resolved at all without the kind of bloodshed that would traumatize the Western Hemisphere for generations to come. Rumors, reality, and the road to nowhere. In the midst of the most serious U.S.-Venezuela crisis in decades, something curious began happening in the digital underground of social media platforms, conspiracy theory forums, and alternative news websites. Stories began emerging, stories that seemed too dramatic to be true, yet too specific to be entirely fabricated. Stories claiming that the unthinkable had happened. Nicolas Maduro had fled Venezuela. The rumors spread like wildfire across Twitter, now called X, with posts claiming everything from intercepted communications to flight tracking data showing Venezuelan government aircraft making suspicious movements. One post claimed a Venezuelan presidential plane, YV-2984, was waiting in Canaima for Maduro's escape, with mentions of him being taken to a bunker amid drone movements. Another alleged that Maduro's plane was intercepted mid-air by U.S. jets and forced to return to Caracas, complete with a video purportedly showing the incident. The most persistent rumor involved a Conviasa flight from Caracas to Havana that supposedly circled the Caribbean before returning to Venezuela, with speculation that Maduro was aboard attempting to escape to Cuba. Social media users shared flight tracking screenshots, analyzed aircraft movements, and pieced together elaborate theories about the Venezuelan president's alleged cowardice in the face of American military pressure. But here's where the story takes a crucial turn, one that reveals as much about our modern information ecosystem as it does about the U.S.-Venezuela crisis itself. Despite intensive searching through major news outlets, intelligence reports, and official government communications, no credible evidence emerged to support any of these claims. The dramatic footage of Maduro fleeing, the intercepted communications, the midnight flights to Cuba, all of it appeared to be digital mirages, rumors that took on lives of their own in an information environment where dramatic stories spread faster than careful fact-checking. Searches for the exact phrase, "new footage of Maduro fleeing," or related terms yielded no reports from major news outlets like Al Jazeera, CBS News, or the New York Times confirming such footage or an actual escape attempt. Instead, results focused on the very real military posturing and historical context that we've been exploring throughout this investigation. This digital phenomenon reveals something profound about how modern conflicts unfold. In previous eras, military buildups and diplomatic crises played out primarily in the physical world, with information carefully controlled by governments and traditional media outlets. Today, every crisis occurs simultaneously in physical and digital realms, with social media users becoming unwitting participants in psychological warfare operations they may not even realize they're part of. Rumors about Maduro's flight served a specific function in this information war, regardless of whether they were deliberately planted or organically generated. They reinforced narratives about Maduro's weakness, his regime's instability, and the effectiveness of American pressure. Each shared post, each retweeted flight tracking screenshot, each comment speculating about the Venezuelan president's cowardice contributed to a psychological campaign designed to undermine confidence in his leadership both domestically and internationally. Meanwhile, the actual Maduro was doing anything but fleeing. Far from cowering in bunkers or planning escape routes to Cuba, the Venezuelan president was doubling down on his defiance in ways that demonstrated either remarkable courage or catastrophic miscalculation, depending on your perspective. The real Maduro's actions during this period paint a picture of a leader determined to frame the crisis in terms that would rally both domestic and international support. He sought international backing, particularly from China, Russia, and Cuba, meeting with China's ambassador to Venezuela, Lan Hu, to emphasize economic and technological cooperation. These weren't the actions of a man preparing to flee. They were the calculated moves of someone preparing for a protracted confrontation. Maduro also petitioned the United Nations, with Venezuela's UN ambassador Samuel Moncada calling the U.S. deployment a massive propaganda operation to justify military intervention. This diplomatic offensive was designed to internationalize the crisis, forcing other nations to choose sides and potentially constraining American options through international law and global global public opinion. The Venezuelan president's public statements during this period revealed his strategic thinking. Rather than seeking de-escalation, he was deliberately raising the stakes, betting that the United States wouldn't follow through on its implied threats of military action. Maduro publicly stated there was no way U.S. forces could successfully invade Venezuela, emphasizing the country's sovereignty and the preparedness of its newly mobilized militias. But perhaps the most telling aspect of Maduro's response was his apparent embrace of the crisis as a political opportunity. For a leader whose legitimacy had been questioned internationally since the disputed 2024 election, an external threat provided the perfect justification for extraordinary measures. The militia mobilization, the emergency powers, the suspension of normal political processes, all of these could be justified as necessary responses to American aggression. The international community's response revealed the complex web of relationships and interests that make modern geopolitical crises so difficult to resolve. While countries like Canada, the UK, and members of the European Union supported the US position and refused to recognize Maduro's election victory, other nations viewed the American military buildup as a dangerous precedent that could threaten their own sovereignty. China's criticism of US unilateral coercive measures against Venezuela carried particular weight, not just because of China's economic relationship with Venezuela, but because it represented a broader challenge to American global hegemony. The symbolism was powerful. Maduro's publicized use of a Huawei phone gifted by Chinese President Xi Jinping sent a clear message about Venezuela's alignment with China's technological ecosystem and geopolitical vision. As the crisis intensified, analysts began questioning the endgame for both sides. Despite the military buildup, experts like Michael Shifter of the Inter-American Dialogue argued that a direct U.S. military intervention remained unlikely, given the Trump administration's stated preference for withdrawing troops from existing conflicts rather than starting new ones. The deployment appeared designed more to pressure Maduro on issues like drug trafficking and migration, rather than to achieve regime change through military force. This assessment raised uncomfortable questions about American strategy. If the goal wasn't actually military intervention, what was the purpose of such an expensive and provocative display of force? If Maduro called America's bluff, which he appeared to be doing, what options remained for an administration that had staked so much credibility on bringing him to justice? The human cost of this high-stakes poker game was becoming increasingly visible in both countries. In Venezuela, millions of ordinary citizens were being trained for a war that might never come, transforming their daily lives and psychological reality in ways that would persist long after any diplomatic resolution. In the United States, taxpayers were funding a massive military operation with unclear objectives and no defined exit strategy. Perhaps most troubling was the precedent being established for future international disputes. If the United States could justify near military action against a sovereign nation based on drug trafficking allegations and election disputes, what prevented other major powers from using similar justifications for their own interventions? The crisis was creating new norms for international behavior that could have consequences far beyond the Caribbean. As rumors of Maduro's flight proved false and the reality of sustained confrontation set in, both nations found themselves trapped in an escalation spiral with no clear path to de-escalation. The $50 million bounty couldn't be easily withdrawn without appearing weak. The military deployments couldn't be recalled without abandoning stated objectives. The militia mobilization couldn't be reversed without appearing to abandon national defense. In the end, the story of new footage of Maduro fleeing revealed more about our collective desire for dramatic resolution than about the actual dynamics of international crisis. In our social media age, we want our conflicts to have clear heroes and villains, decisive moments, and satisfying conclusions. The reality is far more complex and far more dangerous, a slow-burning crisis with the potential to explode into something far worse, driven by forces that neither side fully controls, and that may ultimately serve no one's interests except those who profit from chaos and conflict. The question now isn't whether dramatic footage of Maduro fleeing will emerge. It's whether the very real human beings caught in this escalating conflict will find a way to step back from the brink before digital rumors become tragic reality. Thanks for watching. Check out other cards on the screen.